The following investigation concerns the Vatican antechamber, a sealed chamber beneath the basilica complex, and the first recorded man assigned to sit before a second tomb inside it. His role was simple in wording and extreme in practice. Remain in the chamber and observe the sealed structure over time. No public explanation was ever issued for the position. No theological statement clarified its purpose. Yet the role existed, and it continued long after his death. The first watcher was a Syrian monk named Barackiel. He was brought to Rome in 326 AD during the construction of Old St. Peter's Basilica, a period when the church was transitioning from marginal sect to imperial institution. Excavations beneath the basilica disturbed older burial layers and structural remnants that were not part of the public architectural plan. Most discoveries were either relocated or incorporated into the site's evolving sacred narrative. One was not. A secondary stone tomb structure, separate from the primary burial areas, was identified beneath the foundations. It was not opened ceremonially, it was sealed, and rather than being forgotten, it was assigned continuous observation. The Pope at the time was Sylvester I. Official church history presents his reign as administrative and stabilizing. That context matters. Institutions expanding rapidly often create quiet mechanisms for handling uncertainty. Not everything discovered beneath a sacred site can be explained without consequence. Some things are managed internally. Barackiel appears in transfer records shortly before the first references to the sealed antechamber. There is no scandal attached to his name, no demotion, no promotion, simply relocation. After that point, his public presence disappears. What remains are supply logs and chamber notes tied specifically to the watcher role. Once assigned, Barackiel did not leave the antechamber. This was not theatrical imprisonment. It was structured isolation. Food and water were delivered through a hatch in the chamber door. Communication was procedural. The expectation was constant presence. The tomb was not to be opened. It was to be observed. Why observe a sealed structure? That question is never answered directly in surviving documentation. But the fact that the role existed at all suggests the tomb was perceived as requiring attention. Relics are displayed. Hazards are monitored. Barackiel's early records are unremarkable. He documents air conditions, stone integrity, and the absence of visible change. Months pass without event. The tomb remains sealed. The surface remains unchanged. If the role carried drama, it was not recorded. What changes over time is not the tomb, it is the watcher. Later entries attributed to Barackiel become shorter, more focused. He begins noting environmental subtleties that earlier reports ignored. Variations in light, dust displacement, the feel of stillness in the chamber. He does not claim movement. He does not describe sounds. But the tone shifts from routine observation to intense scrutiny. Extended isolation alters perception. A man seated alone before stone for years will eventually begin searching for patterns in silence. Whether that search is psychological or perceptive is impossible to determine centuries later. What is documented is the narrowing of his attention. Then the reports stop. Not dramatically, no warning, no final statement. The record simply ends. Routine protocol eventually required inspection. The hatch deliveries had gone unanswered. No written reports returned. No sign of response. When attendants entered the antechamber, the tomb was unchanged, the seal intact, the chamber stable. There was no sign of intrusion or disturbance. Barackiel was still seated in the observation chair facing the tomb. He was leaning forward. His eyes were open, his mouth slightly parted. Witnesses describe not panic, but concentration. As though his final moment was spent attempting to resolve something directly in front of him. There were no marks of violence, no evidence of struggle, no record of prior illness. The only detail recorded as unusual during burial preparation was the rigidity of his posture. Attempts to reposition him reportedly met resistance. The forward lean remained pronounced. In any other context, such stiffness might have been dismissed as natural post-mortem contraction. In this context, it was written down. The church did not publicize the event. nor did it abandon the watcher role. In fact, subsequent references suggest the position became more formalized after Barackiel's death. Selection criteria were clarified. Observation procedures tightened. The response was not dismissal, it was continuation. That institutional choice is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. If Barackiel's death had been interpreted as ordinary, the role would likely have ended quietly. Instead, it persisted, which implies the assignment was not symbolic. Barackiel never left his chair. He did not approach the tomb physically. He remained at distance. The next watcher would not. Ambrosius of Monte Cassino would be found closer to the tomb than protocol allowed, and the condition in which he was discovered would suggest that proximity, not mere observation, had become the defining element of the role. Barackiel watched. Ambrosius moved, and that shift would change everything about how the watchers were understood. By the time Ambrosius of Monte Cassino was selected as watcher, the role was no longer experimental. It had precedent. Barackiel's death had not ended the program. It had refined it. Documentation from later centuries suggests clearer criteria for selection and stricter oversight of the antechamber. The watcher was no longer simply assigned. He was evaluated. Ambrosius was a Benedictine monk from Monte Cassino, an order known for discipline, structure, and endurance. The Benedictines were not mystics by reputation. They were administrators of monastic life, men accustomed to routine, obedience, and silence. If the church required stability in the antechamber after the first watcher's unexplained death, a Benedictine would have been a logical choice. Unlike Barackiel, Ambrosius entered the role with a clearer understanding of its history. He would have known that the first watcher had died in the chair. He would have known the tomb remained sealed, and he would have known that the position did not end simply because nothing visible had occurred. Once inside the antechamber, the conditions were unchanged. The hatch in the door remained the method of supply. Communication was procedural. The tomb was not to be opened. The watcher's task remained observation. Ambrosius's early reports are measured and disciplined. Chamber stable, surface intact, seal undisturbed. He writes with precision, as though aware that his predecessor's notes had narrowed before stopping entirely. There is no trace of dramatization in his early tenure. Years pass. But where Barackiel's shift had been subtle and inward, Ambrosius's shift becomes physical. Midway through his assignment, his reports begin including proximity measurements, the distance between chair and tomb, the position of the chair itself, the angle of observation. There is no recorded instruction requiring this. The watcher's designated place was the chair. It had been positioned deliberately at a measured distance from the sealed structure. Ambrosius begins noting changes in that distance. At first, the adjustment is minor, a few inches closer. Justified perhaps as better visibility, improved light, more accurate inspection. No reprimand appears in surviving references. The adjustment seems tolerated. Over time, the entries reveal an increasing focus on surface detail. Not cracks, not movement, but texture. He records faint irregularities in stone coloration that previous watchers had not mentioned. He writes about perceived depth in carving lines. Still no claim of breach, no documented sound. But the attention sharpens. Isolation magnifies perception. Years alone before a sealed object create a form of intimacy. The tomb does not respond. It does not move. But the watcher changes his relationship to it. Eventually, the chair is no longer sufficient. Ambrosius's later reports include notations made without the formal header used in earlier years. They are shorter, sometimes lacking date confirmation. The language shifts from procedural to observational shorthand. In one entry, he writes only that distance alters clarity. The final phase of his tenure is reconstructed not from his writing, but from what attendants found. As with Barackiel, the alarm was absence. Reports stopped. Hatch deliveries received no response. Protocol required entry. The antechamber itself was unchanged. The tomb remained sealed. The chamber showed no disturbance. The chair, however, was no longer in its original position. It had been moved forward. Ambrosius was not seated. He was found on the floor of the antechamber, closer to the tomb than any watcher before him had been permitted to stand. His body was positioned as if in motion, knees bent beneath him, one hand extended forward. Witnesses described the posture not as collapse from the chair, but as deliberate movement halted mid-progress. Unlike Barackiel, Ambrosius had left his designated position. There were marks on the stone floor between the chair's original placement and the tomb. Not deep cuts, not structural damage, but shallow abrasions consistent with fingernail contact against the surface. Near the point where he was found, 4 Latin words had been scratched into the stone. The words were not preserved publicly. Later references confirm their existence but do not record their full translation in surviving accessible archives. What is clear is that the message was brief and carved without tools. This detail changed how the watcher role was perceived internally. Barackiel had remained in the chair until death. Ambrosius moved toward the tomb and left evidence of deliberate contact with the stone floor. There were no signs of forced entry. The seal of the tomb remained intact. No visible breach was recorded. But proximity had increased. The church's response was again not abandonment, but containment. Subsequent watcher protocols appear to have been tightened further. References indicate stricter positioning requirements, more frequent inspection intervals, and clearer reporting structure. Whatever Ambrosius experienced was not dismissed as simple monastic breakdown. It was treated as escalation. 2 watchers, 2 deaths, both facing the same sealed structure. One remained seated, one advanced. If the antechamber was symbolic, the reactions to these deaths would have been symbolic as well. They were not. The role persisted. The 3rd watcher would enter the chamber under the most structured conditions yet, fully aware of the 2 men who had died before him. His name was Frater Antonio, and he would be found closer to the tomb than either of them, in a position that would end the watcher program permanently. By the time Frater Antonio was selected, the watcher role had survived 2 unexplained deaths and several centuries of quiet continuity. It was no longer an obscure assignment. It was a position with history and with risk. Frater Antonio was a Cistercian monk from a small monastery in the Abruzzo Mountains, an order known for austerity and endurance. Cistercians were accustomed to isolation, silence, and rigid structure. If the church intended to prove that the antechamber could be monitored without psychological collapse, Antonio was an ideal candidate. Unlike Barackiel and Ambrosius, Antonio entered the role fully informed of what had happened before him. He knew the first watcher had died leaning forward in the chair. He knew the second had moved closer to the tomb and been found on the floor. He knew the seal had never been reported broken, and yet the role continued. By the time Antonio descended into the antechamber, procedures were strict. Inspection intervals shortened. Written reporting standardized. The chair's position fixed more deliberately than before. The instruction was clear. Observe, document, do not approach. His early reports showed discipline, measured entries, formal structure, no deviation. He records chamber stability, surface condition, and environmental constancy. For years, nothing occurs that would justify the persistence of the watcher system. But unlike the first 2 watchers, Antonio writes openly about the strain of the role. Not theatrically, not mystically, clinically. He references the weight of repetition, the difficulty of distinguishing between perception and imagination, the strain of staring at an object that never responds. His language suggests awareness of the psychological effect of isolation rather than belief in movement within the tomb. Still, he remains. As time passes, subtle deviations appear. Antonio begins requesting additional lighting within the chamber, citing clarity concerns. The request is granted. Later entries note reduced lighting, claiming excessive glare obscures detail. This pattern repeats, more light, then less. Adjustments that seem minor, yet suggest growing sensitivity to visual nuance. He begins documenting the tomb's surface in increasing detail, describing the stone as absorbing light differently at certain hours. He does not claim motion. He does not claim sound. but the tomb occupies more space in his writing than ever before. Years into his tenure, his reports include precise measurements of distance between himself and the tomb. Unlike Ambrosius, who moved gradually without formal acknowledgement, Antonio appears to have been conscious of proximity from the beginning. He records the distance as if proving to someone, or to himself, that he has not advanced. Then the tone shifts. His final structured reports include a phrase repeated twice in separate entries. Proximity alters perception. The phrase is not explained. Shortly after, his formal documentation ceases. Inspection protocol triggers entry into the antechamber. Attendants expect to find Antonio in the chair. He is not. He is kneeling directly before the sealed tomb, closer than any watcher before him. His posture is upright, knees on stone, hands loosely positioned at his sides, his head tilted upward, eyes open, not in terror, not in collapse, but as if fixed on a point slightly above the tomb's surface. The seal remains intact, the stone unbroken. No breach, no structural shift. What disturbs the attendants is not visible damage, it is stillness. Antonio's face shows neither panic nor confusion. Witness accounts describe his expression as focused, almost reverent, though no formal language confirms interpretation. The burial record notes no external injury, no marks of struggle. One additional detail appears in later internal summaries. The air within the chamber felt oppressive during entry, though no environmental anomaly was recorded instrumentally. That phrasing does not appear in earlier watcher discoveries. Antonio had not collapsed in motion like Ambrosius. He had not died seated like Barackiel. He had chosen proximity deliberately. This time, the Church did not simply formalize procedure. Within months, documentation referencing future watcher selection ceases entirely. There are no further appointments, no successor named. The watcher program ends. No public statement is issued. No doctrinal explanation given. The antechamber remains sealed. The tomb remains unbreached. But the role that had persisted across centuries is terminated after Antonio's discovery. 3 watchers. 3 deaths. Each one closer to the tomb than the last. Barackiel remained in the chair. Ambrosius moved toward it. Antonio knelt before it. And after Antonio, no one was ever assigned to watch again. Whatever the Church concluded about that final encounter was sufficient to end a role it had maintained for generations. The antechamber remains. The tomb remains sealed, but no one sits before it now. There is no watcher inside it now. No kneeling figure. No monk documenting light angles. Just stone. If the watchers were unnecessary, they would never have existed. If they were symbolic, they would not have ended so abruptly. The program lasted as long as it was needed, and then it didn't. Whatever conclusion was reached after Frater Antonio's death was sufficient to ensure that no one would ever sit before that tomb again. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Not what the watchers saw, but what the Church decided after the last one stopped writing.